OK, well, let's get the panel's initial reaction to the budget. And interestingly, many of you are aware of Grant Thornton's Business Outlook Tracker, which is a bi-monthly survey of 600 mid-market leaders. And the latest one was done in February. And Karen, interestingly, 77% of the UK mid-market businesses you surveyed were confident that the government would produce a good spring budget. Was it a good spring budget?
Well, I suppose that all depends how you look at it, doesn't it? But I guess what would I say? The Chancellor had a clear plan, which he laid out, and he framed it as a budget for growth. I think you could also say it was a budget for business. There were a lot of business measures in there. If we look at you referenced the Business Outlook Tracker, what's really interesting in that, 3 of the top things that the people surveyed said that they wanted from the budget were certainty around tax, something around levelling up, seeing that levelling up agenda happening, and measures around skills attraction. And we saw measures that addressed all 3 of those, maybe not as much as people would like, and there's got to be a bit of balance and all that, but there were measures in all of that. So I think, on balance, people would probably say that there were definitely positive measures in that budget, and there was something for almost everyone to take, most businesses to take from it.
And interestingly, Jeremy Hunt referred back to that Bloomberg speech, which was done in January, those 4 pillars.
Yeah, and if you look at those, he talked about those measures, he talked about employment, he talked about education, he talked about enterprise, and he talked about everywhere. The everywhere bit always resonates with me, being from the north and various parts of the north at different times in my life. But actually we did see measures that addressed all of those areas, and sort of that's the underpin for his growth plan, isn't it, across those 4 E's, if you like. So I guess what would I say? We didn't see any movement whatsoever. We had that whole hokey-cokey, didn't we? The corporation tax rate is going to be 25%. I think I called it hokey-cokey last time, but it was a bit like a hokey-cokey. 25%, oh no, it's not. Yes, it is. That stayed, no change on that. We didn't expect that to move, and that stayed at a 25% rate, which will apply from 1st of April. But what we have seen announced today were some targeted, quite specific and some targeted business reliefs to encourage investment across capital allowances and R&D, and obviously some measures then around employment. So we'll maybe pick up on some of those, I think.
Yeah, I think let's start with capital allowances, because I think that would be of great use to the audience watching.
OK.
So what did you notice there?
So, well, 2 things. I'll probably start by saying, although it wasn't specifically announced today, it was announced in the last budget, we've got the annual investment allowance permanently in at £1 million. That helps lots of businesses, and it was announced as being permanent, so addresses that sort of certainty point we were talking about, that sort of planning to invest. What we also saw today, and this was trailed and sort of, so we kind of knew this might be coming, but what he did say is that there's 100% a full expensing capital for qualifying capital expenditure. So that's 100% for main pool, 50% for special rate pool. That will apply from 1st of April, and what we will see, therefore, is that ability, and it's going to apply for at least 3 years. So we've got that certainty to allow businesses to think about investing. Now, what's really interesting from our point of view on that, a couple of things, I think. The point about certainty I've talked about, but also in terms of the Outlook Tracker and some of those surveys and other things that are out there, there were a number of areas where people were saying, really, what difference does these tax allowances make towards investment? Well, of the people that we surveyed, 67% of those surveyed had actually claimed the super deduction, so that's quite a high percentage, 2/3. But also 79% of them had said it encouraged them to invest more than they might otherwise have done. So you can actually see that positive encouragement in the budget statement. It said that it would give 3% growth in investment. So I think that's a really positive move towards that investment. It applies to incorporated businesses that pay corporation tax. So importantly, that won't apply to unincorporated businesses, things like large partnerships, which will still have to continue that reliance on the annual investment allowance, that £1 million, if you like. So,
and just on that certainty point, that's for 3 years.
It's 3 years.
The Chancellor wanted to go further, but could guarantee 3 years, which is better than the current 2 years. So again, from that Business Outlook Tracker, there was an indication that 20% of the people who had responded to the survey survey had already started dropping off on
That's right.
investment.
Yeah.
So that may encourage people back in, knowing they've got that 3 years.
Yeah, because they've got that certainty now.
Yeah.
They were starting to falter because they could see the end of the super deduction coming, and therefore that's going to encourage the investment. The other bit that's interesting is that the Labour Party last week announced their business review, and one of the things or the comments that was made by Rachel Reeves around that was that if the capital allowances measures that were introduced by the current government were affordable and were sensible, they would continue to back those if there were to be a change in government. So again, who knows? I've not seen any reaction, certainly in the time that we've had before we're jumping on this panel now. So we've not seen that yet, but you would hope that will give a longer degree of certainty, even if there happens to be a change of government in the meantime. So,
yes, indeed. Yeah. So capital allowances, that was quite a big headline as well.
Yeah.
And then R&D as well, of great interest too.
R&D, yeah. So there've been, in the last 2 budgets before this one, there were a lot of announcements about R&D. There's lots of changes that are coming in from 1st of April. So just to remind people, we've got the extensions, which are really positive from 1st of April to uncover data licenses and cloud costs. So those are coming in. And pure mathematics was another area. So that's a really positive and bringing some of that R&D into the modern world, if you like, around some of that. There are some additional compliance measures that are coming in, and I'll come back to one of those in a moment, but that's around things like notifying that you're going to make a claim in advance, and also the additional information that people are going to have to supply. So those are coming in. And then finally, the bit that was sort of give and take, if you like, was the reduction in the SME rate, which came down from 100% to 86%. But then the RDEC, the Research and Development Expenditure Credit, is increasing from 1st of April from 13% to 20%. So bringing those two closer together.
And there's still more detail to come on that.
There's still more to come. So there's also consultation, which was announced at the autumn statement, around bringing the 2 current schemes, so the RDEC and the SME R&D reliefs, into one single scheme. But the consultation on that only closed on Monday this week. So as expected, we didn't hear any more on that today, but watch that space. But 2 things that were actually in the detail, once you get into the detail of some of this, that are quite interesting. One, which is positive, is that there was an announcement there will be a restriction on overseas expenditure, being able to claim R&D tax relief on overseas expenditure. That's still going to come in, but instead of that coming in from 1st of April, that's been deferred 12 months, and it will come in from 1st of April 2024, which is good news in terms of just giving businesses a bit more time to plan around that. And then the other area there was a change on today that was sort of buried in the detail, is around one of the compliance measures is around an additional information form. So this is all part of the sort of backdrop of this concern around there being fraud around some of the fraudulent claims, etc. So companies are going to have to submit an additional information form. That was going to be for accounting periods starting from 1 April 23 onwards. They've actually brought that forward in the budget today. So that will apply for any claims that are submitted after 1st of August 2023. So that could bring forward substantially the date that information has to be supplied. And it will also mean that might make some claims a bit more restricted because of the timescales. So for example, if you had a business that's the 31st of August 21 year end, then there's a 2-year window, so they could make a claim by 31st of August 23. But they're going to have to then, there's a much shorter timescale, so that's going to stop late claims a little bit or start to clamp down on some of those later claims. So some interesting detail in there that people need to be aware of, I think, as they start to look at their R&D claims.
Yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? And that's where, following up on those conversations are really important because the devil's in the detail.
Yeah, absolutely.
And interestingly, around employment and even education, we got a sort of sense of where the Chancellor was going in advance. A lot of the media had already broadcast a few areas.
I've just got one other thing on R&D.
Have you got something else, have you, on R&D? Go for it.
Just so I don't forget.
Yeah.
So the other area that there was on R&D today was around they made an announcement about the R&D intensive industries. So I talked about the and this is for SMEs. So the SME claim was reduced. The rate is reducing from 1st of April. So there was a glimmer of hope in terms of that announcement today about R&D intensive businesses, and a bit about maybe filling the gap that was being left. Again, in the detail, it's quite interesting because the headline was £27 for every £100 of R&D expenditure, but it will apply to to businesses who have more than 40% of their expenditure, and that's across not just groups but also connected companies and associated companies. They have to spend more than 40% of the expenditure has to be on relevant qualifying R&D. But more importantly, the bit that wasn't mentioned in the statement is that will apply to loss-making companies only. So it will be quite interesting. It will be valuable for startups, for example, in certain situations, but as they start to incur more overhead expenditure or start to become profitable, they won't benefit from that. So what sounded like a really exciting headline, when you get into the detail, is probably quite. It's not to say it's not valuable, but it'll be quite focused in terms of where it will apply and what it will mean.
So can I move on now?
You can.
Brilliant, fantastic.
Yes, sorry.
I sort of teased up the idea of employment and education, and there were many rumours around some of the announcements, and there was quite a big surprise when it came to pensions in particular, which I know we're going to pick up on now. So yes, employment and pensions, what caught your eye?
Well, so if we just talk more, before we get on to the pensions, but still on the labour supply side, there were the announcement around childcare, which is quite interesting. So we talked about the 3 hours. That's going to be phased in, so it's not coming in immediately. So you talked about how that will be phased in to 2025, September 2025, and that wraparound care.
And the reality is because the suppliers need to get ready.
They do, yeah.
To go to market with that.
But it's interesting as well about whether the funding is going to be sufficient. I mean, I've got quite a lot of contacts and clients that I know that are childcare providers in this industry, and I think what's going to be quite interesting is just will the funding be enough? You know, there's an increased funding. I think he said it was increasing by 30%. Is that funding going to be enough to really, allow those childcare providers? They make a loss a lot of the time on the actual free childcare hours at the moment. So how will that work in practical terms? And there's also a really big issue in that industry about just having the talent and attracting the talent, and therefore, whilst that's great in theory and it's all got to be welcomed and it's got to be good news, because anything that then helps to open up that labour market and get more people back into employment is great. How it will pan out practically, I think, is going to be quite interesting.
Yeah, the funding issue is a difficult one, isn't it? I know the Institute of Fiscal Studies have been quite critical on the announcement as well. So again, it's a great idea, but whether it can be adopted in practice is another thing.
How it will work practically, I think, is probably the key question. And then the rabbit out of the hat, as you say, there's always a rabbit, isn't there?
Yeah.
So that was the rabbit. So the rabbit was we already had sort of rumours, hadn't we, about the lifetime allowance being maybe taken back up to 1.8 million. I was smiling when he was talking about experience, because I am definitely in the experienced camp. So I guess, and I can remember when there was no limit before, back in 2006, and all of that coming in, because I've been around for such a long time. But I think what was quite interesting on that is the fact that it's sort of, it went completely. I think people were thinking, it might be 1.8 million again. They might take it back up from, it was just 1.07 million up to 1.8, but basically it's uncapped now, so they've abolished the cap again.
That's amazing, because obviously counterintuitive to earn money with this cap in place.
Yeah.
So that is going to help a significant amount of people, do you think, or not?
It will help high earners. It will help people in, for example, the doctors we talked about, weren't they? People in defined benefit schemes where the value could be quite substantial. And that will hopefully help people. The desired effect is to stop people retiring early, obviously, isn't it? So hopefully it will have that impact. The other bit that was interesting, I think, is for employers that we should pick up on that. I just wanted to flag up from that is the fact that there are quite a few high earners who will not be caught within the auto-enrolment net at the moment. They may have gone for a cash alternative to pensions because they couldn't make contributions because they were limited around that contributions. And also in terms of how the auto-enrolment will work, urgently, because this comes in from 1st of April, urgently those employers need to really have a good look at their auto-enrolment for their higher earners and make sure that they're addressing that. So, and that's something that we can help with, obviously. A bit of a plug for Grant Thornton there, but that's something that employers should be looking at very quickly. And also, again, I would also say it's a great opportunity to look at salary sacrifice. That benefits employers, it benefits the employees as well, so it's a win-win. So people should be looking at that again as well. The other announcement on pensions that was interesting was around that annual allowance in terms of the amount that people can contribute, and it went from 40,000 to 60,000, so quite
50% increase.
50% increase. What is interesting and might be interesting to someone, and you might say, we'll get the violins out, but for the really higher earners, so anyone earning above 260,000, there's still a taper. So the taper used to kick in at 240,000, and that meant that your highest earners, once you got to the top levels, they could only contribute £4,000 because it tapers away. For every £2 of income, it tapers away at £1. That taper will still be in place. So actually, for your very high, anyone who earns 360,000 or more, and again, get the violins out, I know. But if you've got people at that level, they will not be able to contribute the 60,000. Their maximum contribution once you get to that top level will be £10,000. So it's still a great sort of announcement. It's still a great incentive.
So it's gone up by 6,000 for them.
For the very highest earners,
yeah.
Obviously people, but then people in that sort of band between 260,000 and 360,000, that'll be tapering away.
Got it. So very briefly, investment zones. And the Chancellor didn't say a huge amount about this, apart from indicating there's going to be 12 investment zones.
Which sounded almost like lots of parts of the country when he started listing it all out, didn't they?
So we'll 9 in England and 3 in the devolved nations.
Yes.
So anything on that would be interesting?
I think it's just really hard to say much at the moment around that, other than you hope that, Robert might want to pick up on some of that. It might help, it'll stimulate, inward investment. It will also stimulate sort of investment in those areas. And it's all part of that levelling up agenda as well, isn't it, in terms of getting investment in the right places. There's not really been any detail on what those sort of, say, for example, the tax reliefs, the impacts of that might be. We'll have to wait and see how that comes through. But positive news again around levelling up, I guess.
And just very quickly on Pillar 2, again, I don't think the Chancellor mentioned anything, but it's something that we've covered before in our previous webinars.
Yeah, and really important, Pillar 2, the legislation on that will come into play. It will be in the Spring Finance Bill, which is expected to be out next week. So no change on that. Pillar 2 we'll see coming in. Again, for businesses that applies to, so that's groups with turnover over €750 million. If you've not started planning yet, you need to start planning. If you remember, Dan is our man, Dan the man on Pillar 2. If people have sort of dialed into the previous webinars, get focused on that. And again, we're happy to talk to people about that, but it's an area, if you are within those rules and you've not done anything yet, you need to get your skates on.
Great, thank you, Karen. Very comprehensive overview of the budget that was announced just a couple of hours ago. And let's get some quick reactions from the rest of the panel just on the budget before we move on, looking at Q1 reflections and international investment and ESG. So, Shellyan, what were your thoughts on the budget from an economic point of view?
I guess the government was trying to make sure the market steadied, particularly after sort of the Silicon Valley and Signature Bank crash, and I think it sort of did steady. I think the OBR was obviously behind the government. I think when you read the OBR statement, it's maybe slightly less positive than the government has put out there. And I think some of the commentary that's come back, for example, the Institute of Fiscal Studies and others that you mentioned, I think there is room for probably to go into more detail on some of what this means. So Karen was talking about, for example, childcare providers. And I think a number of providers have come out and said, not really going to work for us. We're not really going to provide those extra hours. So I think we need a little bit more detail.
Quite positive, but the OBR were there really providing the context and also the practicality. This is going to take time to have an impact.
Yeah, and I think, they were broadly positive. I think they just, added a little bit more detail. So whereas we had, measures to deal with economic inactivity, OBR was very clear that these things take time. We're looking at sort of a couple of years out and, we're going to have some contraction in the meantime. So.
Yeah. Dave, how about you? What was your thoughts?
Before that, I'd just echo your comment that for Karen to speak like that about a budget so detailed, a budget a matter of hours ago, I'm in awe. And gladly for my colleagues to be relieved I'm not going to say anything detailed about the budget. Karen's done that. But I guess you stand how you feel now compared to how we felt at the mini budget. We felt like we've come a long way, and thank goodness we have. It does give you some confidence. I know there's some detail to come into. But as an employer, one of our limiters to growth is access to resource. So I'd love to see more of the detail, and we've got to do our bit to get there. But the broader scale measures to about care at one end and over 50s at one end, that's something we should really tap into and look at. Because if we can unlock productivity there, then let's go for it. But I think as employers, we have to do our bit. But stand back, it feels a bit better than, a lot better than we were in October. So.
Yes, a bit more sort of stable and certain. Yeah. Now, Robert, I'm saying, Robert, your thoughts, please. Hoping that he's nodding, so hopefully he can hear me, and that we've put you back in, we've connected you back in via satellite. So how are you doing, Robert? So firstly, quickly introduce yourself and then give us your initial reactions to the budget.
Sure. Robert Hanna, I lead the large corporate and government advisory part of Grant Thornton's business, and I also look after all international aspects of our business. So whether that's supporting our clients going internationally or working with our international network to ensure that we deliver for our clients globally. Yeah, having the connection back up to Glasgow is something I'd like the government to invest in so that we don't have a breakdown in communications. But from, I guess, an international perspective, the investment zones was the area we were hoping to hear a bit more about. Obviously, the focus has been how do they attract more direct investment into the UK. Also, you know, where might they be? As you say, up to 12 zones have been confirmed. I think there's about 80 million of funding of a funding envelope in each zone with a range of tax incentives and grant funding expected. And one point I think that did come out is they're going to be based around research institutions such as universities. So they're still focusing on government growth industries, technology, creative industries, but we still don't have all the detail. But that's going to be pretty critical, I think, to help our clients understand how can they access those, as well as obviously attracting business to the UK.
Great, thank you, Robert. Yes, indeed, it's working with those universities and local authorities. It felt that partnership, and then there's devil in the detail again, isn't there? We'll probably be finding out more about the investment zones. But thank you for that. We'll come back to you in just a bit. So that concludes our first section on the spring budget. So we're